Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm really excited to have John Buck here today. John Buck is really into philosophy, and he's done some work on the problem of evil and come up with a theodicy that is pretty unique. And so I'm excited to have him here to talk about that. Welcome, John.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me on the channel. We actually met each other in person at the Capturing Christianity conference. So it was a lot of fun getting to sort of intertwine there.
Yeah. And so I have seen you around online. So you're somebody that I already wanted to talk to. And, I recognized you from YouTube when I saw you there. And so you have, if people want to find you, they can find you on Twitter at Writer John Buck, right?
Yeah.
And then on YouTube, you have a channel called Writer John Buck.
The YouTube channel that's titled Writer John Buck is my old Minecraft channel that I don't use anymore.
Then I have the wrong link on there. Okay.
No, I think you have the right one. The one that I have is the one that's T-Jump's Biggest Blunder. So if you look that up, You'll find that. And that's, I think, just John Buck, which makes it super hard to find. But like if you search up T-Jump's Biggest Blunders, you'll find that. And that's the channel that I intend to put more content on eventually. But right now, my own Minecraft channel is just the one I use for commenting since I have YouTube Premium on it. And I don't know how to change it over.
Cool. Well, let's say hi to some of the people that are in the chat, because I think you have some fans here. So we have to say hi to Slam RN and Craig Reed, who are here. And they Slam RN said you're one of her favorite people. So BS Lewis, who else is here? Bro Guy, welcome, guys. And Velkin1 says, always fun to see Christians running from failed apologetic to failed apologetic. No, this is the right answer. No, this is the right one.
Well, yeah, trust me, guys, all the other theodicies failed. This one, the one that I came up with, that just recently, that's the only one. Don't worry.
Yeah. So, and I actually think that a lot of the Christian responses to the problem of evil are very good. So I think this is kind of one that's more contributing to maybe another, response among the good responses. Now, I know a lot of my atheist friends don't think those responses to the problem of evil are sufficient, and likely they won't find this one good either. If, that's the way that, that's kind of the way this goes. So, but why don't you share with us what is, this is called participation theodicy. So can you explain what that means?
Yeah. So I've written a short, 5-page paper, and I have it pinned on my Twitter account. And I sort of discussed it a little bit in my debate/conversation with Emerson Green on his channel. But yeah, this is a good place to sort of articulate the full sort of idea. And so I call it the participation theodicy. Generally, the approach is to sort of think about how, what might God's reasons be for allowing evil to occur in the world? And I think there's some theosophical approaches that are trying to say God allows evils so that those evils can bring about some greater good down the line of some sort. So maybe soul building theodicy, or maybe skeptical theism says that there is some sort of good that's being brought forward through this evil. We just can't see it from our perspective yet. Whereas my theodicy, at least in what I'm attempting to do, is to try to show that God has reasons for allowing this sort of world in which gratuitous evils can occur. So what I mean by a gratuitous evil is just an evil that doesn't contribute or causally bring about some greater good down the line. So it's not the case, my theodicy, if it succeeds, is going to say it's consistent with God's being all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, and all-loving, and yet there be certain evils that take place in the world that don't actually serve some higher purpose at all. Now, the reason is that God has a sort of I want to say an a priori reason for allowing this allowing evils to occur. And by a priori, I just mean that it's not that the evil is useful or needed for some greater good down the line. It's just the fact that God's reasons come before, without even taking into consideration what sorts of consequences might come about from it. So if we think about like different normative frameworks, we might have a sort of consequentialist framework, which says, oh, any action is permissible so long as it produces some greater good. Like we just sum up the averages or something like that, and then there's some greater good. And then there's going to be other sort of deontological sort of normative theories, which say that no, the fact of the matter, like what consequences might come, is not going to be really relevant. What's going to be relevant is like, what were your reasons for allowing this to occur? What were you intending for to occur? And what like principles or rules were you following that justified you in allowing this to occur? And so I'm trying to sort of put God's like reasons behind why there's evil in the world more so on that sort of deontological side rather than the consequentialist side. Although technically my theodicy could probably work for either, at least in my head. I'm wanting to steer more towards the deontological. So
okay,
right.
so now does this help with, because there's, you know, there comes a point like when you're going through the problem of evil and then you're saying, well, God has reasons for causing evil to occur, and then people say, well, then nothing is really evil then, right? Because it's for a greater good. So is what you're doing, you're trying to avoid calling evil good? Like you're trying to be able to say evil is evil and we can call it evil. We're not saying it's actually good. We're saying it is evil. Is that
exactly? Yeah. Because like we may think about like there's certain like states that actually do help us in some ways, or like are justifiable. Like we might say that working out, that's something that will cause us like great pain and discomfort, but it has some sort of greater good. And so we think, well, it wasn't bad that I worked out. It's just it was like partially good because it helped bring about that good thing. But I want to say, no, there are things that are actually legitimately evil, things that which ought not to occur and play no broader purpose in the great states of affairs in the world. Like it would be a better world without this thing. And so I want to agree like with the atheist who says, hey, look at this. Doesn't this look like gratuitous evil? Some sort of evil that the world would be better without. And I want to say, sure, yeah, I agree. It would be better if that sort of evil didn't occur within the world. But I still want to say that God has reasons for allowing the type of world in which these sorts of things can occur. And if you want, I can sort of go into that a little bit more, like sort of laying out the systematic process, or at least how I have in mind for the greater good or the participation theodicy.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, I have a whiteboard here. I'm kind of tempted to use it.
Go for it.
See how this works. All right, can you see me all right from here?
Your sound is a little bit crappy now. We can't. I don't think your sound is going to work.
There we go. Okay.
So yeah, we want to say that God. Let me get a different marker.
Okay. Hi, Roya. Good to see you. Hey, Captain Kim. Hey, Jamie. Hey, Leo. Okay, go for it.
All right, no whiteboard. My markers.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
My bad. All right, so yeah, just the general idea is God could have created like a perfect world right off the bat, like a heavenly world in which everyone is in perfect harmony with each other, loving each other. There's no evil, there's no sin, there's no pain, there's no suffering, anything like that. God could have done that. God has the power. He's omnipotent. He could do anything. And so he could just snap that type of world into existence. But what my theodicy sort of goes into is like that type of world would technically lack a certain good. And what good would that be? The good that world would be lacking is the good of creaturely participation in the bringing about of that sort of great world. So we want to think that like, well, God is all generous towards creation. And so if God is all generous, then it seems like he would have some reason or motivation to allow creatures to contribute in some way, sort of that spread of generosity. And creatures could contribute towards the bringing about of that ideal world where heavenly reality in which there's no pain, suffering, or anything like that. But God realizes that like in order for creatures to actually contribute and bring about that like heavenly reality, creatures would have to first exist in a world that's not that heavenly reality, because like you can't help bring about something that is already the case. It's already the case, and so you didn't do anything in helping to bring about. So in order for you creatures to actually contribute towards bringing about this sort of reality, they would have to exist in a reality in which that is not the case initially. So if it's not the case that creatures exist in a heavenly reality, then there's going to be a lot of opportunities or possibilities for failures and various sorts of sufferings that might occur. But there's still the possibility or that these creatures could contribute by making the world escalatingly closer towards that heavenly or ideal state of affairs that is kind of imagined. And so we can think about like, okay, for any great world that God could have created all on his own, there's another world that in which the great things about that world are not had initially. And it's just, it's a world, it's the same type of world, just without those good things. And that's the type of world in which those creatures, if there were any creatures in that world, could bring about that good thing. But they would have to first exist in a world in which that good thing is not there. And so that, like, for any good thing that we might imagine in the world, this is, we can say that God would have reasons for creating creatures in a world differently, where allowing God to have any reason, God to have reasons to create creatures in a world in which that good thing is not there, so that they could contribute towards bringing about of it. So just as like one particular example, I think that like my Theodicy can sort of respond to the problem of divine hiddenness, where it says that if God existed, then there would be no non-resistant non-believers in the world. Yet there are non-resistant non-believers, therefore we have reason to think that God doesn't exist. That's the problem of divine hiddenness from J.L. Schellenberg. And I want to say that the first premise is going to be false because, sure, if God were to create the world all by himself, then yeah, God wouldn't have any reason to create a world with non-resistant non-believers. But if God wanted creatures to contribute towards a world in which all rational agents were in communion with God, then God would have a reason to create a world in which those rational agents aren't yet in communion with God, so that they could be brought into communion, so that they could contribute towards that bringing into union with God. And so that would give God a reason to create a world in which it's just not initially the case that everyone is already perfectly aware of God's existence, so that creatures can contribute towards like making people aware of God's existence or through various ways.
I love this because this is justifying my evangelism, right? I'm really thankful that God has given me the opportunity to contribute to the salvation of others by being able to share the good news and, you know, various things, loving people in certain ways that helps them, it helps the goodness of God and the love of God to be revealed to them. So that's one of the things I love about this Theodicy. Keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So just in regards to another example, so we can talk about like the problem of animal suffering, like William Rowe's fawn sort of example, where we imagine a world or we imagine a state of the world in which there was a forest fire that took place and a small fawn was trapped under a limb, a fallen tree branch, and then as the forest fire was taking place, it got burned alive and suffered a horrible agony during that time period. And we want to say this is a sort of evil that doesn't like contribute in any way towards greater goods down the line at all. And we want to say, yeah, that is true. That's a gratuitous evil. And I want to grant, like, technically you don't have to accept that there are gratuitous evils. I'm just saying that, like, for the sake of this argument, you can grant that. And actually explain why there is this sort of thing. And so what we want to say is that the world in which there are no sorts of dangers towards wild animals or anything like that is going to be an ideal sort of state of the world. But that's also going to be a sort of state of the world in which creatures could contribute towards bringing about. Like it could possibly be the case that human beings or some species similar to human beings sort of like develop these highly sophisticated sort of reservations or sanctuaries for animals, in which case there's not going to be these dangers of wildfires that take place. And that would be a great world in which that could happen. But in order for creatures to contribute towards bringing about that great world, they would have to first exist inside of a world in which that's not the case, in which case there can be these sorts of like forest fires and things that happen that do harm and damage animals in the wild. And so that would give God reason to initially create a world in which it's not the case that it's ideal initially, so that the creatures could contribute towards the bringing of that good ideal state of the world.
Now, cool. When in your document about this, you used a story from a rabbi to kind of illustrate the point. Can you do that?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually learned about the story from a rabbi or a moil, I guess, and he had explained it to me. This was back even before I even considered myself like really a Christian. But anyway, it's a sort of like apocryphal tale about the Rabbi Akiva. But basically, it goes where Rabbi Akiva is out sort of in the square where people dialogue and things like that. And this is during Roman occupation. And some of the Roman guards were sort of like talking to him like, hey, why is it the case that Jews circumcise themselves? It seems like if God wanted men to be circumcised, then God would have just made them that way. And so Rabbi Akiva, he responds by asking a question. Well, which works are greater, God's works or man's works? And that sort of like stuns the Romans, like, what are you talking about? Of course, God's works are going to be greater than man's works because like God can create from nothing, whereas men have to work with it's already there. And then Rabbi Akiva shakes his head. He's disagreeing with them, which is like totally radical from like thinking about like a very pious rabbi. And he makes as an example, he points to like the sheaves of wheat that might be out growing. And he'll point to them and say like, look at these sheaves of wheat. They by themselves are not going to be edible. They're going to be tasteless and awful and gross. They're not going to be very useful. But when we take what's there, and he points this out as an example of God's works. But when man takes God's works and refine it and bring it into unity and like bring about extra ingredients and things like that, man can create like a warm loaf of bread. And this warm loaf of bread is like magnificent, especially in comparison to like the sheaves of wheat. And so the idea is that when men contribute or work with God towards the bringing about of the ideal state of affairs or the ideal world, this is better than if God were to create all by himself, because this has both man and God sort of participating, working together to bring about the great world that could be brought about. It's funny, the rabbi or moil that I was talking to about this, he sort of like his pinned point, I guess, to it was almost like, well, why did God create the world? It was to give man something to do. And it's kind of like, yeah, I guess he's kind of right that like if we were just created in a sort of utopia, we might not be as satisfied as if we actually were able to like contribute towards that utopia. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of story from Rabbi Akiva, or about Akiva, which is yeah, it's fun.
Cool. Okay, yeah, I love that illustration, and I like this Theodicy because I do think it's beautiful for God to give us the opportunity to contribute to the world in real ways and to contribute to the goodness of the world. And like you're saying, it doesn't seem like if God created the ideal world, then there simply wouldn't be the opportunity to do that. So now you have how do you want to go about, do you want to talk about the objections, or do you have more that you want to explain about this?
I can go into the objections. It's funny, like since writing my paper, I had sort of accumulated like 3 what I thought were really good objections, and from talking with my atheist friends and stuff like that. And now I'm actually going through the process of writing a whole new paper that's a little bit longer, that sort of like draws out a little bit better of the like tries to flesh out the Theodicy quite a bit more. And now I'm thinking about like all new ones. There is an objection that I read from someone that sort of brought up the point that like you could have a sort of like creaturely participation towards the ideal world without ever having the sort of initial phase where it's not ideal and starting off. You could just have a world which sort of relies upon creaturely sustaining in order for it to be good. So like we can imagine a utopia working together, and there is still that participation there where people are like working together and like helping to bring about the good state of affairs. but God just sort of like orchestrated everything so that it always stays in a sort of harmonious sort of fashion, which I would like totally grant. Yes, that would be a really great state of affairs. That would be a wonderful world for God to sort of bring about. But I can just say, okay, if it would be good for God to bring that world about, it seems like it would also be good for creatures to like actually bring that about, because if it's good for God to do it and creatures could also do it, then it seems like it would also be good for creatures to do that. In which case we can say, well, God could have done this all by himself in the same sort of like reasoning as the general theodicy, or he could have allowed creatures to bring about that great world, that sustaining world, I guess. And so like if God is ultimately generous, then it seems like God would have reason to sort of share the praiseworthiness for bringing about this ideal sustaining world with creatures. And so God would have a reason to refrain from creating that sustaining world initially right off the bat, and instead create a world initially not sustained in perfect harmony. And so that's going to be a world in which there's going to be evils that can occur. So that's like one objection that I've sort of thought about and tried to sort of respond to.
Yeah, and this might be a good place to, I wanted to read these three questions that you presented, and you said, if the answer to all three of these questions is yes, then God would be morally permitted to bring about such a world where the eventual goods what it could have are initially lacking. So you said the three questions are, would it be good for creatures to bring about that good world? Could creatures bring about that good world? And would it be good for God to allow creatures to bring about that good world?
Yeah, those are sort of the three conditions that I say that would be required in order for God to be morally permitted in sort of creating this less than ideal world. The fact that creatures could actually contribute towards bringing about the ideal world or the better world or the great world. The fact that it would be good for them to do that thing, and also that it would be good for God to allow them to contribute towards that. And like, to sort of elaborate that a little bit better, we can imagine a world in which there is creaturely participation in the bringing about of good things, but things start off really, really bad. Like it's a world in which everyone's in perpetual suffering and horrible shame and awful experiences and things like that. But there is still like creaturely participation there, where like creatures can like ease the suffering of somebody by like a minuscule amount, and then that person can sort of ease the suffering of somebody else by like a minuscule amount. And it seems like there's like they're doing like good things kind of in that they're like easing suffering. But I want to say that the creating of that world initially is going to feature so many like intrinsic evils, and it's not going to be the type of world in which it would actually be good for the creatures to bring about good states of affairs. It would just be less bad. And in which case I want to sort of draw the distinction. Something can be less bad without actually being good. Like I want to say that for something to be good, it has to actually like be feel good, or it has to have something worth desiring within it. But like for something to be less bad doesn't have to have something like worth desiring in it. It just has to be like less something that I don't want to be around. It's something I want to be around more than what I don't want to be around. It's something kind of like that. So like just to sort of draw the point, a world in which there's like perpetual suffering and torment is going to be an awful world. But we could say that a world in which all that bad stuff is sort of put an end to would be a world in which like everything ceases to exist. And so you could say, yeah, the world in which everything ceases to exist would be less bad than that world in which everyone is suffering for all of eternity. But would it really be a good world in which there's absolutely nothing at all that exists within that world in which everything was obliterated? It doesn't seem like, yeah, there's anything good there. So what I want to say is that like there's a distinction between avoiding bad and actually bringing about good things. And so I want to say that for God to be justified in creating a world, it would have to be actually intrinsically good for creatures to contribute towards bringing about, rather than extrinsically good, where it's only good because of avoiding some bad. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And this is the part where I get confused about the intrinsic and extrinsic. And so, but also I was kind of confused about the like, hold on now, I lost it. But basically, like, I guess what you're saying is there has to be a limit to the less than ideal world that God can create, because at some point it like crosses the line from just being like a less than ideal world to like that, like basically a hellscape that like can't that goods can't, like intrinsic goods can't come out of.
Yeah. Like there's going to be a difference between a not perfect world and then an actually bad world. And I want to say it would be bad for God to sort of create a world in which everyone's just suffering perpetually. That would just not be something good for God to do. But a world in which there's sort of like neutral things, or like ways in which creatures can sort of like slowly but surely gradually contribute towards the ideal state of the affairs, that's going to be an actually intrinsically good world rather than an intrinsically bad world. Now there's going to be like in this world, there's still going to be like some bad things that can occur, but it's still going to have, God's still going to have reasons for bringing about that world. In which case, I just don't see God having reasons for bringing about the world in which like there is all this evil and like maximal to the maximal degree. I think I call it in the paper a hell world of some sort. So yeah, that's kind of the difference I was trying to draw between the two.
Yeah. Well, what about like people, and there are people like this who do think this world is just so full of suffering that they would say it's beyond that less than ideal world you're talking about. It is in the space of that like place of suffering. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that I want to say that while there is certainly a great deal of suffering that very few people are actually recognizing, at least honestly, that within there are still like good things that are being brought about. Like creatures do things for good reasons. Like the reason why a lion might like try to kill a gazelle is not going to be because like it causes the gazelle to be tortured and like experience pain. Rather, the reason the lion is doing it is for its own good. It's like it pleases the lion to some extent to go out on that hunt. And so there's like a good there that's being had by the lion, even though it's a good that comes at the cost of the goods for the gazelle and other examples. So that would be a case in which while there are these bad things that are happening, they're happening for, I guess, good reasons. Not necessarily like reasons that overpower, like the good of the lion isn't necessarily greater than that of the gazelle, but it's still a reason that gives the creature, I guess, reason to act. Now I'm trying to recall your exact sort of like question.
It was like for those who think that the suffering of this world does outweigh the like potential for good, because they're seeing it more as a torture chamber. Mm-hmm. You know, like you mentioned in the thing, like the torture chamber. So, right. How do you respond to people who, like, for them, that's what this world is?
Yeah. I guess, like, to me at least, it doesn't seem exactly the same as the hell world, because in the hell world, there is no actual like positive goods that are being realized. There's only the avoidance of certain great or negative evils. But in this world, it does seem like there's a lot of positive goods that are being realized. Like any sort of pleasurable experience is a type of good that's being had by someone. And now it might not be the case that like those goods overall outweigh the evils that take place, but it's still the case that we exist within a world in which positive goods can be had. But in the torture hell world, that's not a case in which positive goods can be had at all. There's only avoidance of certain evils. And so that's going to be the significant difference between the hell world and our actual world.
Well, see, now that kind of gets into the intrinsic versus extrinsic goods. Mm-hmm. And I talked with a friend about this because I didn't understand this. And I couldn't, even with that friend, come to an agreement on what would be an intrinsic good and what would be an extrinsic good. So like when I was thinking about what would be an intrinsic good in a torture chamber, I still feel like there would be intrinsic good that could be built. If one loved their enemy that was torturing them, then there could still be an intrinsic good even in a torture chamber. So I don't know, but I need to understand what you mean when you say intrinsic good and extrinsic.
Yeah, so what I mean by intrinsic is just going to be something that is had in virtue of itself, whereas an extrinsic thing is going to be something that is had in virtue of its relation to something else. So I want to say that avoiding evil is a sort of extrinsic good, because compared to the evil that would occur had you not avoided it, that would be worse for you. And so it's not the case that you're avoiding evil for the sake of avoiding evil, but rather you're avoiding evil for the sake of something else other than the thing. Where it's not the case that you're moving towards something because you want it, you're moving away from something because you don't want that. So that would be like an extrinsic. You could also say it's maybe like an instrumental good, although I think that's sometimes a little bit less clear. Whereas a intrinsic good is something that is worth having for its own sake. So like pleasurable experiences or like virtues or character traits and things like that would be good things worth having for their own sake. Now, as you brought up, in the hell world, like, or torture world, we can imagine that like I'm going to sacrifice my own life so that this person's suffering is diminished partially, and that would be like a good virtue to sort of build up as part of your character. But I'm going to say that while it would be good, I guess, to sort of develop that virtuous character, it's only going to be good in virtue of the fact that there's already these evils in place. It's going to be like it's using basically the evil to, I guess, usurp it in some way. So like we can talk about like the virtues of charity that might take place within Auschwitz or something like that. We have these two prisoners in the camp, and one of them maybe like gives up a piece of bread to a friend of theirs, knowing that they're going to be poorly nourished, whereas their friend is going to be actually nourished because they're giving up that thing. And that's like a really genuine sort of act towards the other person. But it's the fact that they're in that sort of circumstance is itself going to be a bad thing. Like, it's not good that these people are in Auschwitz so that one of them can sort of like share bread with the other. It's going to be good it's going to be I don't know. I want to say that the goods that are had in that are going to be partially based on the evil circumstances that they find themselves within. And so to me, it doesn't seem like the evil circumstances in which that good can occur is going to be something worth desiring for its own sake.
I see. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Now, maybe if it's the case that world is already there, then they're developing those virtues, but like developing, or like that world itself, that set of circumstances isn't something that like we should try to like bring about. It's not the case that we should like try to make the whole world a little bit more like Auschwitz just so that people can be a little bit more virtuous towards each other.
Right. Okay. Now, what are the other objections that you mentioned in your own paper? And then after that, like I have some objections. A friend from the channel, guys, if you know Chad on the channel, he wrote a response to your participation Theodicy, and my son also responded to it very briefly. So I'm gonna I want to hear the other objections that you brought up in the paper so we can take care of those, and then I'll throw the other ones at you.
Yeah. No, this is fun, like getting brand new objections. And like, I might just feel like, you know what, that's a good point. I'll have to think about that further. But like, okay. We'll see. Like, I have been thinking about this a lot. And so like, I don't know, we'll see. One of the other objections that I presented in the paper, and is actually similar to the objection that Emerson Green raised in our debate with each other, is just to sort of point that like, we don't see it to be the case that creatures are actually contributing in any significant way towards this ideal world. Like a lot of people, when faced with the sort of cruelty and suffering that happens in the world, are sort of like complacent towards it, or just not really caring about it at all. And so like, sure, this is an opportunity in which creatures could like try to remediate those sorts of evils that are taking place within our actual world. And yet people aren't really motivated towards doing so. And so like for Emerson, it seems to him like, well, okay, this is like a mark against your theodicy, because like we should expect that people are actually going to be motivated towards doing the great good. But here's where my reasoning can come in once again. Like, yeah, it would be really great if everyone in the world were like motivated towards bringing about the ideal state of affairs. And that's a world that God could have like brought about initially just off the bat on his own. But if that would be good for God to do, and creatures could contribute towards bringing about that world, well, then God would have some reason for creating initially a world in which that's not the case. It's not the case that everyone is ultimately motivated by exactly that which is good. And is rather, there's going to be quite a lot of people that are just not motivated by the good, but at least some that are going to be motivated by the good in a way that can sort of like build off of itself, so that people will become more virtuous and then develop greater moral character and then become more powerful in their technological capacities and also their influence over the world and things like that as time goes on. It's just going to be a very slow process because each step in the chain has to be sort of like brought about by the previous people or the previous set of people in the world, and they're going to have limited powers, they're going to have limited resources, limited moral motivations and things like that. So like that's one objection. Like I don't think my Theodicy necessarily predicts that everyone in the year 2022 is going to be ultimately motivated to actually contribute towards the embetterment of the world at all, but rather at some point through a long, arduous process, I'm sure people will be provided the opportunity to actually contribute towards the embetterment of the world and will act upon that opportunity so that the world actually does improve over time. And I don't know, I brought this up in our debate. I was actually sort of raising almost like a theological argument for God's existence based upon the sort of escalation of improvement of values over time. And it's something I actually want to develop further as an actual, like, argument from our argument for God, just based upon, well, if naturalism were true, we wouldn't really expect this sort of like axiological improvement over time. And yet, if theism were true, we would sort of expect something like this to occur. And lo and behold, we do sort of observe some, at least very gradual improvement of things over time, like biological processes and things like that. Or even the fact that going from like non-living to living, that seems like a step up from what was like all the good things in the world. This was like a whole leap basically, and new good things that took place in the world. And so that would be like a little bit of axiological improvement that occurred. So that was another objection. I think I have one more, but like the two were sort of like similar to each other. So I'm welcoming, I guess, the objections from Chad and your friend.
Oh, yeah. And also there's been some great questions in the chat. So there's going to be a lot of responses. But there was something you said, hold on, that I wanted to ask about. Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, it feels like to me people who are a little more pure-hearted have a harder time with the problem of evil. It's like Emerson, he seems to me like a really pure-hearted guy. And so I'm sure he's very moved with compassion and things like that, and tends to see like the rosier side of humanity. Yeah. And sometimes I really think like people like that do have a harder time with like the gospel. But I don't know. Because for me, I don't always, sometimes I see a rosy view of humanity, but I'm also faced with the reality of human history, what we've done to each other, what we still do to each other. I mean, I just told somebody off by email like earlier today, and I'm like, oh, why did I do that? That was so mean. I'm so rude. Anyway, so maybe my view of humanity is not as high, so I have no problem like saying, okay, this world is full of evil, it's you humans' fault, and like moving on. But anyway, this is...
No, it's funny. I do tend to like see that almost like switch between the more secular people. They have a much more rosy sort of optimistic view of human nature and human anthropology that I personally just don't see. Like you look at human history and it's like full of really horrible, awful people. And to think that like we just happen to be a lot better than them just because we're a little bit more technologically developed is laughably naive in my opinion. Like, as I see it, people are mostly moral nowadays just simply because there's societal structures that sort of prevent that from being the case. But if you took away those societal structures, a lot more people would be just as savage as people were 500 years ago.
Yes, and if they had more to lose. I mean, if they didn't have so much to lose. I'm sorry. I said that backwards. They have so much to lose. Like all of us
Oh,
people who have like a good life, you have a roof over your head, you've got a car, or maybe you just have transportation or whatever. You have a good life. You're eating and you're not facing some of the worst things in humanity. Well, it's, maybe you're not acting like a savage because you have a lot to lose by acting that way. And maybe if your um comforts were stripped from you, you might see a little bit different picture of who you are. But anyway, this is going off on a tangent. Okay, so let me see what I wanted to bring up. Okay, well, I'll just bring my son's objection to you first, okay?
Sure.
So my son looked at it and he said, this doesn't work. And I said, why? And he said, because he brought up like, okay, could there be one less evil event in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And still there be a world that was less than ideal for us to contribute to.
Yeah.
And so I had to say yes. And then he was like, okay, so it doesn't work. Like, because God could have made that world where there was one less evil. And so what do you think?
Yeah, like I can totally grant that, yeah, God could have created a world in which there was one less evil or one less opportunity for these sorts of evils to actually take place. And it would be good for God to do something like that. Then we can ask the question, okay, well, if it would be good for God to do something like that, would it be good for like humans or like creatures to bring about that type of world in which there's going to be this less evil in the world, and so, or less evil that can take place? And it seems like, yeah, it would be very good for creatures to actually causally contribute towards bringing about that sort of world. In which case, we can just say, okay, well, then God would have some reason for allowing that world to initially not be that sort of case in which these sorts of evils can occur, so that the creatures could contribute towards bringing about that world in which less evils can take place. So, like, I don't know if we want to like draw it into exact. God could have created a world in which malaria is just not a possibility, just because mosquitoes aren't able to be infectious or something like that. Like, sure, we can grant that. Yeah, it would be great if God created that type of world, in which malaria is just not a thing that can possibly take place. But if we want to say it would have been good for God to create that type of world, that would have been good for God to do, then we can just ask, okay, well, would it have been good for creatures to have brought about that type of world? It seems like, yeah, it would have been good for creatures to have brought about that type of world, in which case God would have a reason for allowing creatures to causally contribute towards bringing about that type of world. And so God would have a reason for initially bringing about a world in which malaria can actually take place. Even if, like, for some reason we had developed the technology or managed to avoid malaria beforehand. Like, it's not the case that the actual occurrences of malaria is what, like, is needed to bring about the ideal state of affairs. It's just ability that can take place prior to that eventual escalation towards the ideal state of the world.
Okay, now I'm finally getting your, because I think you talked about this a little bit earlier and I was kind of fuzzy on it. Mm-hmm. So now I see what you're saying, because like that's one thing that was kind of confusing me in your paper, is I was like, what does he mean that like the progression of this less than ideal world? And you were actually responding to the thing that my mm-hmm. son presented, right? Mm-hmm. Like you were saying, okay, yeah, we can say that, but then it's okay. I got it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, once you understand the sort of like formulation of the argument, where, okay, we have this good thing, like the atheists will like, well, why didn't create this world? And we can say, yeah, that would be really good if God created that world. And then we can just move one step back and say, like, would it be good for creatures to make that world? And then, like, yeah, it would. Okay, well, then God has a reasons for making that world in which creatures can actually contribute towards the great world. And
okay,
so,
I got it.
And then you just going back as far back up until the point in which there's just it's not possible for creatures to contribute towards any great things in the world, or there's just some sort of threshold of like, that's way too much evil. This is now a bad world. This is not the type of world that God would create.
Okay. Well, let's see if that works for this objection. This is from Chad. And he said, the intrinsic goodness of group participation in the creation of an ideal world. It outweighs the intrinsic goods. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm messing this up because he's saying these are questionable assumptions. He's questioning this assumption. The intrinsic goodness of group participation in the creation of an ideal world outweighs the intrinsic goods that are lost as a result of that participation. So he says, like, okay, look, throughout history, many families have been torn apart with loved ones being lost to mental and physical illnesses. Other sacrificed goods might be happiness, fulfillment, relationship with God, etc. So the intrinsic good of group participation comes at the cost of these other intrinsic goods. What should we think? Why should we think that the net result of this sacrifice is a world that is more intrinsically valuable than its potential alternative? And like adding into that a lot of people don't get to participate. So I think you responded to this a little bit, but I don't know if I'm satisfied with your response. So can you talk that through?
Yeah. So I think there's like sort of two objections. And I want to first deal with the Chad's objection, where there's all these goods that are lost because of the limited nature of the world and resources and our powers and capacities that really damage people and horrify them, strike terror, and basically like are great evils. Or we can think about the goods that are lost, like a father loses his child of like 1 year old, and he lost that ability to develop a relationship with his own son. And so that's like a really great cost that came about because of the way that the world was. Now, I think that probably where my theodicy I don't know. I always want to sort of tack this on, but I don't want to put too much emphasis on it because I don't think that the compensations that God might provide towards the creatures in the world are actually what like do any of the justification towards the evils that God allows in the world. Rather, it's just the case that given that there are these goods that are lost, then God would have a reason for compensating those that had to undergo that loss of certain goods. So just as the example, the man that loses his child at a young age, in the next life, God could provide them the goods that were lost initially. So if there's an afterlife, then God would have a means by which the goods that of like relationship with his son can still be fulfilled, even though they were initially lacking within the world. And the reason I want to say that it's in the next life that God would sort of like provide these compensations rather than in this particular life is that, well, in the next life, creatures can actually contribute towards the goods in the world. Like that's just outside of our plane of powers and capacities. And so that's going to be a type of world in which like only God could actually causally contribute towards bringing about the good things within it. Whereas so that would mean that, of those three conditions that I gave, like that creatures can, it would be good for them to do so, and that they can do so, and that it would be good for God to allow them to do so. They can't do that. Like in a world in which it's just immaterial beings, physical beings like you and I have no power over that sort of realm. And so that would be a world in which God could actually provide the goods that were initially lacking for the creatures that had to undergo all the suffering in this world, could actually be sort of have those goods. And so there wouldn't be really a sort of like balancing out between the goods of participation and then the goods of like that were lost, because the goods that were lost initially could still be had in the next life. It's just it's a life that creatures couldn't have participated towards. And so that's kind of like always one route to take in responding to that.
Yeah, and I'm satisfied with that. I believe God will compensate people, and so I'm satisfied with that. But now I think to answer this next objection, we should set up the breakfast scenario, because I like the breakfast, making breakfast for mom. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, just a way to sort of like articulate the, I guess, motivations behind the theodicy is we can think about a father who loves his wife very greatly, and they have like a couple of children. and the father wants to do something special for his wife. He wants to make her breakfast in bed. And now he's an expert chef. He could like create her breakfast in bed to an excellent degree and provide it for her. And she would like greatly enjoy it. But he wants to, since it's Mother's Day, he wants to allow his children to actually participate in the making of breakfast. So he wakes them up early in the morning, and they're like real young. They're like 5, 3, and maybe like 1.5 or something like that. So it's going to be sort of hard for them to really contribute very meaningfully towards the breakfast. But the father would like allow them to do whatever they can. Like maybe they're like pouring orange juice or maybe buttering toast or something like that. And so there's, to a limited degree, the younger children are able to actually participate in the bringing about of the breakfast in bed for the mother. And then by the end, like they present it to the mother, and yeah, it's not great. Like there's a lot of like eggshells in the eggs maybe, or like burnt toast, and like the butter's all lopsided and all that. But like the mother would still appreciate it greatly because she sees that, oh wow, this is something that my children did for me out of their own love and wanting to do something good for their mother. And so she appreciates it all the more. So like, in my mind, I guess God would sort of be representing both the father and the mother in this scenario, where God's sort of like appreciating the contributions that we're trying to bring to the world and like encouraging us and things like that, while also putting us into the situations in which we actually can creaturely contribute towards the embetterment of the world. And so I know that like maybe to some atheists, this isn't going to sound like a very good sort of articulation of the real problem of evil, but it's just there to sort of like at least get to the motivations behind it. Like, yeah, I certainly grant that child cancer is much worse than like eggshells in your scrambled eggs or anything like that. It's just the main idea behind it of wanting to bring in sort of participation in this good thing. Like the breakfast itself would be a really great thing. And so that's why God wants to sort of share in the bringing about of it. So like we can say the ideal world, the heavenly world would be like a really great thing. And God wants to allow creatures to help contribute towards bringing it about. And so that's why God like initially makes it a world in which it's not yet heavenly. So yeah, that's kind of.
And I love that analogy. I think it's beautiful. And but here's Chad's objection to that.
Yeah.
Imagine if the father knew in advance that one of his children would accidentally add the wrong ingredient, causing a fatal allergic reaction in their mother. In that case, should we expect the father to value the participation of his children over the health and safety of his wife? The participation theodicy requires one to assume an affirmative answer to this question. When it comes to God and his creations, we must assume that God values the participation of his children to such an extent as to justify all of the death and suffering that has ever occurred, not only among people, but animals as well.
Yeah, so there's one way I could sort of go in responding to this by just sort of going over the same sort of thinking about the Theodicy, where like, okay, if it would be good for God to create a world in which these sorts of evils are non-efficacious, they don't have any effect in the world, then, and that would be like a good world for God to create, then we can just ask, well, would it be good for creatures to actually contribute towards bringing about that world? In which case, okay, well, so we have a reason why, or God would have a reason for why he might allow creatures to help bring about that world, in which case there are going to be efficacious evils that do take place. And so I think that's where I want to partially push back. And it's not that the evils that do occur in the world sort of outweigh the goods that are going to be had or anything like that. The evils themselves are legitimate evils. They're not things that like help in bringing about the goods at all. They're just, I guess, like side effects that God will foresee that are going to occur, or something like that. Like you don't need to take a strong commitment on God's foreknowledge or anything like that. Just the fact that God can be aware of the fact that, yeah, there's horrible evils that can take place, like the Holocaust, like the rape of Nanking, like the Black Plague, these sorts of things. God can foresee that evils like that can occur. And it's not the case that God's saying, well, I know that in the end, that's going to outweigh the evils that take place. And so I have reason to sort of like create this world. Now, that is a route some might be able to take. Like, I think like universalist sort of theodicies almost go that route. They're saying, oh, well, all the evils that take place in this world are going to be ultimately outweighed by the eternity of bliss with God. And so like whatever evils that you might see in this world are automatically going to be outweighed. And I just don't think that's like an appropriate way of responding to evil. I think that like, no, that would be like weighing out evils for goods. And that's just, I don't know,
that's what you're trying to avoid. One of the things you're trying to avoid with this is like trying to make something good come out of something evil.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because like, there's a sense in which like, if God is like creating evil so that they like work towards the good, then it seems like, well, how much is God like authoring that evil then? It seems like, no, I don't want to like be committed to that as a theist. And so I want to say that God is aware of the evils that can occur and would recognize that they don't contribute in any meaningful way towards the greater goods down the line, but God would still have sort of like deontological reasons, not comparative like consequentialist reasons for allowing these sorts of evils to occur. I think those are, like, I guess, my two sort of responses to that. Like, one, there could be like adequate compensation for all the evils that take place, in which case, yeah, I guess there is a sort of like overbalancing of goods to evils eventually. But like, I'd rather avoid all that and just talk about the deontological reasons God might have for allowing there to be a world in which these sorts of evils can take place, even though those evils themselves aren't going to be part of the overall plan, I guess, for the world.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I kind of thought of, I don't know, tell me if you think this is a bad response, but for me, I just feel like one of the benefits of God doing this is that the world isn't contrived. Like, it's like not, it's not like set up in order that like every decision you make has an obvious outcome, and that like that, where like you are aware of every possibility. Like there's an amount of randomness that like allows our world to not be like this contrived world.
Yeah, exactly. There's genuine creativity on the part towards the way that the world ends up. Now, God could have like decided like, okay, this is the way that I want the ideal world to go, and he sort of set it in motion where every step is like perfectly contributing and everything is like that. But that would be a world in which God alone was the one that actually it was up to him how the world turned out to be. But it seems like to me a better world would be one in which creatures had some opportunity to actually contribute towards what way the world happens to be through their decision making and things like that. And so that's going to require there to be legitimate sort of creativity, or I guess you could say randomness or creaturely sort of like spontaneity that takes place through the process. And so like I think the fact that you and I are like mammalian bipeds is a sort of like creative component that our genetic ancestors sort of brought about. There was like legitimate participation with God and a creaturely contribution, in which case like we happen to have a serious like significant amount of defects, of course, like appendix and issues and different things like that, which might not be like, it's not the case that we're like perfect biological organisms, but it's still the case that we are the products of creaturely participation towards the eventual ideal state of the world.
Well, now there's where we're going to have a bit of a difference in perspective, because, but you know what? My audience is going to love that. Guys, he believes in evolution. See, you can believe in evolution. You can be a Christian. But anyway, I don't believe in all that stuff, but I did. And actually, this is one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting, your perspective about like natural disasters and stuff, because you made an interesting point. Now, I still like, I have a bit of a different perspective, but you were like, like the objection that would arise would be, well, but what about types of like natural disasters and things that like actually humans can't really control? Mm-hmm. Like we can't seem to, and you suggested, well, we can overcome some of these things, by putting preventative measures in place, or, like I think you mentioned like mosquito, anyway, there's different like disease prevention things and stuff that are ways that we can control. But there are some natural disasters that you say, hey, maybe what is allowed for there is that we can control it by like we can shape the world in a more ideal way by asking God, who does have the power to overcome those natural disasters, and maybe that's the way that we are shaping the world. Now, am I like messing that up? That
No, no,
explanation?
yeah, no, that was definitely in my paper, and I don't know. I've since kind of thought like, well, that's probably not the best response, and so I want to like develop like maybe a better
Okay.
response to actually natural evils. Now, I do think that like that's a sort of genuine route that could be taken. That like, yeah, of all the natural evils, like the way like let's say entropy is a sort of state of the world in which like our universe is eventually going to end. Like technically, there's nothing we can really do about the natural laws and the way that the world works. But like God, since he's omnipotent, he could sort of change the laws of nature if he wanted to. And like maybe it's a case that God is sort of like waiting for creatures to genuinely ask him. Or maybe it's a case that like once creatures have done all that they can in sort of the bring about of the idealization of the world, God sort of does the rest by changing the laws of physics or something like that. That's a possible route that could be taken. I'm not like ultimately satisfied by that, to be sure. But I think, yeah, there's another one. It's just the general idea that like, yeah, it would be an ideal world in which there weren't these sorts of natural disasters that could take place. But in order to avoid, like, in order to make it true that there are no longer natural disasters that can ravage creatures at all, then it would have to have first been true that they could ravage creatures. And so that's why there might be these initially laws of nature that do allow for tectonic plate shifting and hurricanes and flooding and things like that that can take place, just so that the good of harmonious interaction with nature could eventually be brought about through creaturely participation. And that might require creatures doing legitimate sort of environmental sort of like technological developments and things like that in order to avoid those sorts of natural disasters that might occur.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess maybe like I'll just share a little bit. I wonder if my perspective might contribute something, but a lot of people will just think this is flat out crazy. But I think like the physical and the spiritual are way more connected than we often give credit for. And I do think that humans are like collective evils may be contributing to the way that nature is responding. Because in the beginning, God gave us dominion over the earth. We were supposed to be the governors of the earth, and we still are, but we're not governing it the world in the best ways. So it seems like, you know, even in Romans, it says that all of nature is groaning in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed, and that it's burdened. And so it may be that nature is responding to our collective evils in the way that it's reacting. So maybe if we were all loving each other instead of killing each other, then nature would be kinder to us. We kill, so it kills. So this is just my idea. I don't think that it's necessarily like, you know, a domain that humans don't have participation in.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that is a really interesting sort of approach. And there are like some like I guess metaphysics in which that can make there can be made sense of, like where the physical domain is sort of like less fundamental than the mental domain, in which case like our mental intentions of love and appreciation towards each other are going to have a sort of like ripple effect, I guess, in the physical world out there. And yeah, it's definitely an interesting thought. And yeah, I guess that could be a way in which like even the sort of like natural disasters or like various laws of nature could, like creatures like us could contribute towards affecting in some way. Like I have a friend who's like an idealist, and I've always thought that like idealist in the sense that like the everything that we experience is just fundamentally like experiences. There's no like physicality to the world. It's just almost like a dream state where everyone's in a sort of collective dream. And I've always thought that like in that sort of world, there could be the possibility for like the patterns of nature to just change based upon human subjective perception, given that, I don't know, so like everyone just decided to start dreaming in some particular way, then yeah, you could suddenly have a world in which these sorts of evils no longer take place. And so I know that's like pretty far out there, but I mean, it is an interesting, I guess, way to think about this. And like, you probably don't need to go that far out there, just this sort of idea that no, the way that you interact with the world does affect reality. And like, that's generally a common opinion by a lot of people on the more outskirts of, I guess, the scientific vision of the world, but that's fine because like science doesn't tell us everything. It is, yeah, it's an interesting approach. Yeah, I like it.
Cool. Okay, now Chad does have more discussion, and I think if it's okay with him, I'll just send you his response, and maybe you guys can have a talk about it sometime.
Yeah.
But I want to get to some of the questions and comments in the chat. Now, I wasn't reading everything. So if I miss yours and you want to put it in there, then just wait a little while. And if yours doesn't come up, then put your question in again or your objection. Okay. Jason Torn says, this view seems to contradict God's omni properties. Why allow gratuitous evil if God is tri-omni?
Yeah, so I'm not sure where he's getting this idea. I guess he's thinking that I'm saying that like God can't prevent all evils because God's not powerful enough or doesn't know about them or just isn't motivated to actually do something about them. But no, I'm like trying to utilize all of God's omni properties in order to articulate why we happen to live in the world in which there are these types of evil. So God's ultimate goodness is what motivates him to be generous towards creation and allowing them to participate in the bringing about of the ideal world. God's omnipotence is what gives him the power to generate a world in which creatures have the capacity to ultimately contribute towards the ideal state of the world. And then I guess God's knowledge is what's giving him the, I guess, foresight to know, okay, this is the type of world that were I to create it, creatures could eventually bring about the ideal state of the world. So this is totally reliant upon the tri-omni conception of God, not some like process theism or open theism of any sort. Although like open theism is a live option, sure, of course.
Yeah. Okay, well, this might be a good place to bring up one of Chad's objections because I think it's related to this thing that Jason Torn is bringing up. So Chad makes an argument. He says, premise one, if maximal intrinsic goodness can exist without T. Okay, sorry. T is the intrinsic good of group participation in the creation of an ideal world. Okay, so if maximal intrinsic goodness can exist without T, then it's possible for God to create a maximally good world that does not include T. Premise two, maximal intrinsic goodness can exist without T because God has always been maximally good without T. Premise three, therefore, it is possible for God to create a maximally good world that does not include T. P4, if it's possible for God to create, this is so much. I don't know how you guys do this philosophy stuff. This is just, I cannot get into this, but I don't know if you're following this or not, but this.
No, yeah, I am.
You are. Okay. Okay. So P4, if it is possible for God to create a maximally good world that does not include T, then T does not account for why God chose to create a world in which gratuitous suffering is possible. P5, if T does not account for why God chose to create a world in which gratuitous suffering is possible, then the participation theodicy is false. Conclusion, therefore, the participation theodicy is false. Now he explains premise 2 saying, classical theism holds that God is unchanging, uncreated, and the highest good. This entails that God has always been intrinsically good to the highest possible degree. In other words, God is or includes maximal intrinsic goodness. Okay, so basically, why do we need maximal intrinsic goodness can exist without the participation? So,
Yeah. Oh, you might want to like put Jason's comment off. It's sort of distracting. But yeah, I get where it's sort of coming from. It's almost like the perfect world objection to classical theism that like, oh, God existing by himself would be in a perfect state of the world. So for God to create anything at all, there's going to be something other than God. And so the perfect state of the world is going to be diminished, but a perfectly good being can't diminish the world in any way. So that would give God no reason to actually create a world at all. Like that's a sort of like perfect world objection to classical theism or perfect being theism. And it's sort of similar to that. I think he's trying to say that God, being a maximally great being, would have all good things within himself. And so by allowing creaturely participation, that's not going to be some like additional good thing that's added to the world, because God already has all these good things within himself. So that's not going to be a reason for God to actually create a world in which creaturely participation take place. And I want to say that God doesn't have creaturely participation within himself. God is a maximally great being insofar as whatever attribute it might be worth having is one that God would have. It's something that's sort of like that. But creaturely participation isn't an attribute worth having. It's a way, it's a positive way in which to interact or to act in the world. So like, it's good that creatures participate is a description of the behaviors, I guess, or the behaviors or the actions performed by subjects. It's not going to be a description of the subjects themselves. So when we say that God is the highest good, that's going to be a description of God's attributes. It's not going to be a description necessarily of God's behaviors. Like, it's not the case that God is all good because he happens to do all these good things. God is going to be all good in the sense that, well, I mean, he's also going to be doing good things. But the reason that God is all good, what we mean by that is that every attribute that it would be worthwhile to have, God has that attribute. But like I was saying, the good of creaturely participation isn't an attribute of a being. It's going to be a evaluation or a value based upon action. So like a good act, a good way to act or interact with the world. And so I'm going to say that, no, it's not the case that every good thing is had by God initially. Because like I'm like the fact that I exist, I'm a good thing, but I don't think I existed in God. Like I wasn't like part of God as like God's this sort of conglomeration of all the good things. And then God sort of like brought me into existence by like popping me out of himself. That's like a very flawed sort of conception of God's maximal goodness. God is a maximally great being. He has every worthwhile attribute to the highest degree. But he sees that it would be good for there to be other good things that also exist. So God exists perfectly by himself, but through his generosity or through his desire to sort of share existence with others, he brings about things other than himself. And so now you have the greatest possible being plus this other less than greatest possible being that also exists. But this thing is still good. So you have an infinite good plus one. So it's not the case that God diminishes the world by creating. God adds to the world. Now, it's not the case that he adds to himself because he's already maximally good, but he adds to the world. Like a world is different from God. Now, sure, in a world with God alone, God's going to be the only entity within that world, but the world is going to be a description of the way that things are, whereas a being is going to be a thing with attributes and properties or abilities to act. It's a causal entity, whereas the world is just a description of things. So, I don't know. That's like there's like two objectives. Yeah,
God, I love you. You're great. Yes. Okay. So Leo says this, and I don't understand this at all. This is one of you philosophy guys' ways of talking. Okay. Leo says, I don't think the distinction between consequential and deontological is important here. If John takes a normative view, ought these things in virtue of their justification occur?
So if John takes a normative view, ought these things in virtue of their justification occur? Just because something has a reason to occur doesn't mean that it ought to occur. So like if we think about two prospective parents, they might have a reason to have a child, but that doesn't mean that they ought to have a child. Like it's not the case that these two parents, they have a duty to bear offspring or anything like that. It's the case that through their love for each other, they can decide freely to outpour that flow of love to others. And so they could decide to have one child, two children, or three children, or no children at all. Like it was perfectly up to the parents to decide whether or not they want to bring about this good thing of having a child. It's not the case that they're like morally restricted and they ought to do this thing. In the same way, God is not like morally obligated to like create the world. It's through his outflowing of love that the good things in the world do occur.
This doesn't sound very Catholic, John. I thought you were a good Catholic. I'm striking you off the mailing list of the Quiverful movement.
Oh, no.
No, I'm just joking. No, but really, aren't you Catholic?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. But like,
Okay.
it's not Catholic teaching that as somebody in a marriage, you have an obligation to bear children. It's just that you can't work against the natural end of bringing forth children. So if you were to commence in the act of procreation, you can't do anything to like go against that act of procreation. So you can't use contraception or do so in other ways to avoid it. Well,
I'm kind of just teasing you, but anyway, yes, I get your point. Yes, and I hope that answered your question, Leo. So let's see. Now I don't know if I should let this. Okay, I'm just gonna let these questions come. Some of them are not that relevant, but Brokai says, what happens when God performs the evil himself rather than just allowing it, such as when he tells his soldiers to kill everyone except the virgin women and keep them as slaves?
Yeah, so
I'm throwing you the softballs today. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't think that God can perform any evil action, not because like whatever God does is thereby automatically a good action, but just God's moral nature will restrict what he would do. Now, I do think that there are occasions in Scripture where there's almost an anthropomorphization of God that's sort of like the children of Israel's sort of like perspective of God is going to be less morally accurate, I guess, than as we've sort of progressed through society and like no longer see slavery as like a positive good or anything like that. And so like one such example, like in Scripture, it talks about how God is like pleased by the sweet smelling savor of burnt offerings. And I don't think that like God desires people to like kill animals just so that he can smell how sweet it is. Because for one, I don't think God has any sort of olfactory senses in which he could, well, I'm sure he would know what it smells like, but he doesn't like technically smell things at all. But I do think that like God appreciates the intention of love towards himself and allows for those that want to express their love to God to do so through sacrificial means. So like somebody has something that's very desirable of them, very desirable to themselves, their beloved goat of some sort. And in an expression of love towards God, they kill that animal. Now, I think God has gradually sort of like try to migrate his followers away from sort of animal sacrifice. And so anyway, I just sort of brought up that point about how within Scripture, I think we sometimes get this sort of anthropomorphized version of God in which God is sort of like bloodthirsty or more war-torn and interested in sort of like the success of like certain genetic sort of families to take place. And so I think that within Scripture, we are seeing it from a sort of very, I guess, biased lens. That being the children of Israel, they wrote down what they believed God was telling them and acted in the way that they believed God was telling them. And I think God allowed for that to occur so that we could get a more fleshed out, full picture of what humanity is like and humanity's interaction with God is like in this sort of like very fleshed out, broad expression of human interaction with God. And so that's why I think that like God would for there to be these sorts of like immoral conceptions of God that take place within Scripture so that the broad range of human emotion and expression towards God can still be allowed and articulated. Because like,
oh wow, so is this kind of like the Randall Rouser view?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I quite appreciate his sort of understanding of like biblical inspiration. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, now this question is for me, so you get out of the hot seat for a minute, okay?
Great.
Danish debater says, "But is your chance to contribute worth the risk of another's eternal soul?" I don't think that there is any risk to a person's soul with what I'm doing. So what I mean is, I feel like God has given me an opportunity to contribute to revealing himself to the world. But God is ultimately he is in the process of revealing himself to everyone. So even if I totally mess up, let's say instead of being a loving example of God's love and a great example of God's love, and, you're like, wow, God is real. And, and I understand this good news. Instead of that, let's say I do something horrible, and totally turn you off to the gospel. Well, I still believe in God's power and love to overcome and heal and redeem in other ways. So I think of God as like a mosaic artist where, he takes broken pieces of things and he can make them into something beautiful. It's not that, it's good that the things got broken, but that he's very masterful in being able to work those things together to bring, to fix my mistakes. Let's just say that. So I don't think anyone's soul is resting on what I do.
Yeah.
Okay. So non-traditional ex-Catholic says, John, do you tend to think that a world with racism is ultimately better than a world without, since we cannot rise above racism in a world without racism?
Yeah, so I think that he's almost like, and I get it. There are a lot of similarities between my theodicy and like a soul building theodicy. I think that some soul building theodicies almost like want to paint the picture that no, it's good that we have people like Martin Luther King Jr. who are able to contribute and like overcome the evils of racism and work for social justice and things like that. I'm not really going that approach. I'm saying that, like, yeah, we can admit that racism is an intrinsic evil, that it would be better if the world did not have those things. But the very fact that these sorts of intrinsic evils can occur is going to be justified by God, because that's going to be ultimately part of the process of allowing creatures to participate in the bringing about of the ideal world. God could have initially created a world in which there's no possibility for racism that takes place at all. And if it would be good for God to do that, then it would also be good for creatures to causally contribute towards bringing about that world. But in order for them to causally contribute, they would have to exist initially within a world in which racism can occur at a widespread level. So that's, yeah. I've become a bit of a broken record, but it's sort of important to sort of like emphasize, okay, the structure of the theodicy, once you understand it, you can sort of apply it to other situations. Yeah.
Yes. Brokai says, if we can contribute to our own well-being without God's interference, then of what use is he?
So, like, in my mind, I don't think that we can do anything at all without God. Like, God is the ultimate sustainer of all things and being. And whenever we do actually like experience positivity within the world, we're partially experiencing God through a lens darkly, of course, because God is the ultimate good himself. And so anytime we do anything to contribute towards our own well-being, we're doing so through God's non-creaturely contribution towards us, because like we can't exist without God, and we can't experience any positive good states at all without God. So I guess that's where I would add, like, sure, I need to argue for that, but like there's other Thomists that have sort of already presented those arguments as it is anyway. So that's not the purpose of this theodicy, of course.
Yep. Okay. God created murderers and rapists for a reason, so you call out to God while you're getting murdered.
No, that's not the purpose of the theodicy at all. It's not saying that, like, oh, it's such a good thing for people to call out to God when they're being murdered and raped. No, it's not like that's something that would only be good, I guess, extrinsically, if even that. Like, I think that, like, so it's not the case that God creates these murderers and rapists so that some greater good down the line can be had. It's just the case that a world in which there are no murderers and rapists, just because everyone is a perfect moral character, would be a great world for God to create initially all by himself. But it would also be a world that would be great for creatures to contribute towards bringing about. So God would have a reason to create a world in which there is a possibility for murderers and rapists to take place, so that the creatures within that world can contribute towards the ideal world.
Oh, this is totally irrelevant. I'm just Seawolf. All right, go ahead, John. What do you think about angels?
I don't have much thoughts about angels. For a while, I was kind of like skeptical, I guess, towards it, but it seems like they're very much within the Catholic tradition and Christian tradition overall. So yeah, I do think angels are real, and I think that angels probably do contribute towards the world in their own unique way. So it's not the case that angels are probably doing a lot of like physical manipulation of matter or anything like that, but angels might be doing other things on a sort of spiritual realm that we probably wouldn't be able to observe or even contemplate.
Wow, why were you skeptical about angels for a while?
So I was raised in a very fundamentalist sort of Pentecostal, sort of very spiritual sort of household, and I don't know. I was sort of turned off by that, just given that I don't know. I like understanding things, and it seemed to me that a lot of that was just almost like emotional. It's emotional sort of stirring up within themselves. So I don't know. There's a period where it's like, well, what are angels really doing in this idea? And so for a while, I just didn't have any like primary understanding. Okay, what are angels doing? Why are they there? What's their purpose? And so I don't know. Since becoming more involved within the Christian tradition, I'm more open to it, I guess. But yeah, I don't have like significant reasons for being skeptical.
Okay, I see. That's interesting. Okay, so Chris says, how can you explain people with disabilities, pick any medical condition at any age, kind of makes God a sadist, a worse, and incompetent at best if you believe it made things that way?
Yeah, so like we can talk about childhood cancer. That's sort of the primary example that atheists like to bring up. And so like I don't think that childhood cancer like is good that it exists. I think it would be better if we existed in a world in which there was no such thing as childhood cancer, because we had developed the medical technologies to sort of avoid those sorts of things from ever taking place, or had a high enough immune system towards cancer and things like that. And I think that it would be good for God to create that world initially, but I also think that would be good for creatures to contribute towards that type of world. And so that's why God would have a reason to create a world in which initially it wasn't the case, in which childhood cancer couldn't take place. And so there are going to be the possibilities for all these various different medical disabilities that can take place, so that creatures can contribute towards a world in which there's an ideal way that the world works together without these sorts of disabilities.
Cool. Okay. Captain Kim says, can I do evil such that the participation possibility is enhanced?
That's an interesting question. Like, I guess, like, I don't know, we can imagine some sort of like Thanos-like character who wants to maximize the amount of participation that could take place. And so he realizes that in order to do this, he must I don't know, I guess create twice as many creatures that are currently existing in the world, so that there's even more limited resources, but more creatures like very minusculely sort of like contributing towards the idealization of the world. Like just by snapping his fingers, he does that. Yeah, I guess you could do that. That's something that you could do, but it seems like it would be something that you shouldn't do. It's an evil to do that sort of thing. And so I guess the question is like, okay, well, if it would be evil for him to do that, why wouldn't it be evil for God to do that? And that's, yeah, an interesting. I guess I want to say that, like, by doing that sort of thing, you're thereby making the world worse through your action. But I don't think that God creating a world from nothing is making the world worse. He's doing something good because he's bringing about a world in which there are these good things. And then allowing those good things to causally contribute towards the bringing about of the ideal way that the world could go. But if God were to like set back everything through some sort of miracle, then it seems like that would be a bad thing for God to do, because it's taking something that was already there and then like making it worse by like going against the very structure of it. And so, yeah, I guess I don't know if that's exactly where he was sort of where he's going with his sort of question, but that's at least where I was sort of taking it. So that's.
I love that you imagined a scenario like on the spot. That was good. Have you thought about this before?
Not that particular example. I mean, there's always similar things that I've kind of been thinking about. But yeah, that is an interesting one. I just sort of, came up with the sort of Thanos connection.
Okay, here's a question for me. So you're off the hot seat for a minute. Non-traditional ex-Catholic says, well, how would you explain the existence of things like the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs that were no humans yet to anger nature? So would nature kill the dinosaurs? Why would nature kill the dinosaurs? Okay, well, non-traditional ex-Catholic, I don't believe you're bringing out the young earth creationist in me. I don't believe the dinosaurs lived before humans lived. I believe the dinosaurs lived with humans. I don't believe they were wiped out with an asteroid. Okay, so yeah,
He might
so
just
that's
be
my
asking
answer.
you just so that you'll see the question. I don't know if it might be that it's for me as somebody who does.
Do you? But you weren't saying that we angered nature.
No. Oh yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah.
I was saying that we because we met like the connection between the way nature acts and the way humans act. But if you have you can give a different response to this if you want.
Yeah, because I think it would also sort of apply to my theodicy as well. So like, well, what about all these creatures that were going about the world and then God just suddenly made them extinct? How is that fair? It seems like if God really wanted all this creaturely participation, he would have allowed the dinosaurs to continue to creaturely contribute towards the idealization of the world. And I'll just say that, yeah, like it would be great if the dinosaurs were able to continue to contribute in some small way towards the idealization of the world. But given that like we exist within a non-ideal world, there's the possibility for these sorts of evils to take place in which mass extinctions can occur. Now, it would be great if we existed in a world in which mass extinctions couldn't occur, but and God could have made it that way. But if creatures can contribute towards a world in which these sorts of bad things can't happen, then it would be good for creatures to contribute towards bringing about that world. So that would give God a reason to create a world initially in which mass extinction events can occur. Something sort of like that. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, now Lena says, so the Bible's not inerrant. Which parts of the Bible are divinely inspired?
So I think that like Randall Rouser, he does take an approach where the Bible is inspired, but so are its errors. And there's another, I want to say, inspired imperfection. There's this inspired imperfection. And it's not by Randall Rouser. It's by another Christian author, Greg Boyd. Okay, so Greg Boyd, yeah. He has a book called Inspired Imperfection, in which he does articulate a view in which the entirety of Scripture is inspired by God. God is what sort of like produces or is like working with humans to sort of write a sort of story of the world that he wants to, I guess, be part of his message to humanity. But he allows for humans to imperfectly put things down. And that's like consistent with divine inspiration. It's just that God's inspiration isn't intending everything to be perfectly accurate to the highest degree. God's more interested in allowing creatures to, I guess, express their theological opinions and beliefs in a way that's poetic and also meaningful and something that can last through time. And also through that sort of inspired, poetic, sort of errant understanding of the world, be able to like provide a gospel message so that it could go down this trajectory that God is wanting. It's been a while since I read that book, but yeah, that's Greg Boyd's book, Inspired Imperfection, which sort of lays out that view. Oh, I can't hear you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so non-traditional ex-Catholic says, inspired by Captain Kim's question, wouldn't John want to celebrate all evils since these evils work together toward the greater good? Now, we did already respond to this and say that no, actually, in this theodicy, evil is evil, and you're not, and some evils don't work toward the greater good. But it actually does bring up kind of like an objection. Maybe I'm not coming up with this. It might be a Chad's thing, or I don't know if I'm coming up with it right now. But I'm just thinking, like, aren't we still indirectly saying that all evils lead to a greater good, because we're still saying that this less than ideal world, like the evils that occur in it, were necessary for the building of the ideal world. So like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, even if it's not directly contributing to the greater good, every evil is indirectly contributing to the greater good, because it's allowing for this world.
Possibly. So, like, I don't think that the actual occurrence of the evil is what's like directly or indirectly sort of like bringing about the greater good. It's just the world itself is sort of created in an imperfect state in which a lot of evils can occur from it. Now, some evils might occur or other evils might occur, and it's neither evil is really like necessary to get to the higher state. It's just that both of them can occur, or neither of them could possibly occur. But the very fact that they can occur is sort of like what's necessary. And it's not the evils themselves occurring, which is what's necessary to bring about the greater good. It's just the very fact that they can occur, that world. And it's kind of funny that non-traditional ex-Catholic sort of brings up this point, given that, like, at the very beginning of the live stream, I sort of articulated my view in such a way that, like, okay, here's what most theodicies are doing, and I'm doing something different. So, I don't know, maybe.
Well, he might not have been here for the whole thing. So a lot of times, people jump in halfway through. So maybe he wasn't here for that part of it. Okay, here's the last question that I saw. But if there may be more, guys. If you have a question that I haven't put up yet that you really want to ask, then please put it in now. Because, Leo says, well, we're made in God's image. Wouldn't God be anthropomorphic to some degree?
Yeah, so that's an interesting sort of like way of logical realizing we're like, okay, if we're made in God's image, then God must be like us to some degree. And so, yeah, I can kind of see that. There's some aspect of ourselves which is common, I guess, to God because we get it from God. Now, there are some understandings of the image of God, the imago Dei, which isn't really to do with some sort of faculty or ability or likeness that we have, but is more to do with like a role that has sort of been ordained for us. Like John Walton, he has this view where the image of God is more to do with the priestly leadership that God sort of gives to Adam and Eve. He gives them these roles to sort of rule over the garden, and in order to sort of make the world into the type of place that would be fitting for God to dwell there within the temple of the garden or of the world. And so that's one way to sort of understand the image of God without having to say, we look like God, or we have some aspect that is just like God. It's rather just, okay, we are the image bearers to God in the sense that, like, okay, when you're, like, if a king were to sort of like give someone his signet ring so that they could stamp some message and present it to the world, that would be, in a sense, that person acting in the image of the king. They would be doing something under the role of or under the banner of the king in some way. And so I think that's sort of the way that John Walton sort of understands the image of God conception. Now, there are other conceptions of the image of God that's more to do with like, the very fact that we have rational faculties, we can like act on the basis of reasons, we can understand things logically, we can see the world, maybe consciousness is the image of God, something like that. I don't know. I think both views are pretty plausible to me, that like at least rationality is something that's kind of unique to humans. And so maybe that is something that God sort of like divinely implanted into Homo sapiens at some point, or maybe before that. Or God could have created Adam and Eve through special creation, and then those they interbred, I guess, with the other great apes that were out there. I know, like your young Earth creationist sort of views will come in conflict with that, but there's a couple different approaches to this question.
Cool. Leo has a bunch more questions, but Leo, I feel like your questions are gonna take quite a long time, and some of them are off topic, and I think it's about time for us to close out. So maybe we can have another conversation with Leo or something in the future. I just want to put up this comment, and Seawolf says, I'm confident God will choose to draw me near when I'm dead. He does have an affection for me, I cannot deny. He wants me to be closer to him later on. Sea Wolf, you need to repent of your sin, turn to Jesus Christ. And I have to say this because my time with you guys may be short. I really hope that you guys will reconsider your thoughts about God. We have a very beautiful and loving God, and he does love you. And so I hope that you will turn to him.
Yeah, why wait till later when you can do like God wants to be in relationship with you right now? So don't put it off. Like enter into that relationship with God now while you can.
Yes. Okay. So, John, do you have any final thoughts? And well, before I do that, I just want to plug because people might start leaving if they think it's ending. So, guys, please subscribe to John's Twitter, writer John Buck. The link is in the description. Please subscribe to John's YouTube channel, John Buck. The link is in the description. And John, I just want to say I love your theodicy. And, I don't know if any theodicy is perfect, but so I can see some of the objections raised. I don't know if there's a full answer to any of them, but I think your theodicy is added to my list of things that I think are like good responses to the problem of evil.
Nice. Well, thank you. I want to say, let's see. I think that what sort of led me down this pathway in sort of considering this sort of theodicy is through the problem of animal suffering. Like, I think that's a legitimate problem that quite a few of the other theodicies don't adequately respond to, like free will defense or something like that. Just is more so going to be applied to human moral evils that take place. And sure, there is a story that can be told regarding how, like, animal suffering is all because Adam and Eve sinned, or maybe angels sinned at some point. But I think then the question is just going to be, well, why would God sort of orchestrate a world in which like human sin affected innocent animal creatures in this way? This seems like almost like immoral, I guess, for God to sort of orchestrate this very precarious world in which like one little sin from two humans is going to affect the entire rest of the world, to where animal predation and snakes and venomous spiders and different things like that can all take place. Like, it's hard to see the logical connection between one and the other. And so that's where I've been trying to sort of think about more so, okay, what would be the justification that God might have independent of like human sin or angelic sin or anything like that, but more to do with like, well, why would God create an initially imperfect world in which lots of evils can occur? And that's where like I've so far found satisfaction in my theodicy in thinking about this sort of problem. And as time goes on and thinking about objections and considerations further, I've become surprisingly more confident in my theodicy, even though I am very much trying to like, okay, what are the best objections that people have to offer? And I do really try to consider them. Like, if it's the case that my theodicy has some sort of like utter failure to it, then like I want to know, like, if I don't want to be defending a theodicy that can be ultimately crushed by one devastating objection. And so that's why I'm like trying to, so yeah, if anybody has objections, feel free to send them to me on Twitter or anything like that. And I am looking forward to reading your friends' sort of further objections if they'll allow me. But yeah, it's something that's a very active process that I'm still going through.
Cool. And Leo says, you asked for more questions and then you refused to answer mine. Leo, it's just that you had like 4 questions that require very long responses, and I'm kind of trying to wrap things up now, and they weren't all related to this theodicy. So, but I'm happy to explore this topic with you further, and I bet John would be too. So anyway, we can continue the discussion another time. Thanks everybody for being here, and have a great day.
Bye.